Sitchin reads the tablets as saying the Anunnaki came from Nibiru at the edge of the solar system, and that the planet approaches Earth on a 3,600-year cycle. In that interpretation, Nibiru is much larger than Earth and rich in iron oxide, which turns its waters red, while the damaged atmosphere makes the world increasingly hostile to Anunnaki life. The narrative then jumps back roughly 445,000 years before introducing the Sumerians as an advanced people who lived in Mesopotamia from about 4,500 to 1750 BCE. The source explains Mesopotamia as the land between the Tigris and Euphrates in the region of modern Iraq, where separate walled cities were ruled by their own kings. It presents Sumer as one of the most advanced ancient civilizations, with a complex written system used for records and poetry, plus major achievements in agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy. The Sumerians built cities including Uruk-ur and Lagash under organized rule by kings and priests, before the source says stronger Akkadian and Babylonian powers brought their civilization down around 2000 BCE. Even after that collapse, the source says, Sumer left an important legacy and turns to archaeological discoveries at Khorsabad in Iraq, while noting two different versions of how the finds were made. One version places an unnamed British archaeologist there in October 1849, while another places a French team, led by Paul-Émile Botta, at a major Assyrian palace discovery in March 1843. The source says excavations at the palace yielded 14 stone tablets describing an ancient civilization, human creation, and powerful beings portrayed as gods or sky people with an otherworldly appearance. Those beings are identified as the Anunnaki, and the source gives the name the meaning those who came from heaven to earth, while linking early use of the term to inscriptions from Gudea's reign. It dates that material to roughly 2144 through 2124 BCE, and the third dynasty of Ur, before introducing researchers who studied the tablets and then focusing on Zecharia Sitchin. The source says Sitchin spent 30 years studying the material and published The 12th Planet in 1976, where he argued that the Sumerian gods called Anunnaki were refugees from another world. In the source's account, the early tablets concern creator gods, and it connects those beings with Genesis, Eden, Adam, and Eve, while saying the first tablets describe who they were and where they came from. It then says later tablets describe creation on Earth, genetic manipulation of the human race, and advanced technology which Sitchin interpreted as knowledge brought by beings who came to Earth. As Nibiru became less hospitable, the source says the Anunnaki lost resources and food, even though their technology mixed advanced methods with what the narration calls alchemy and magic, and required gold. The source claims gold was useful because of its purity and says gold nanoparticles could help repair an ozone layer and resist cosmic radiation, while pointing to gold foil used on space equipment. Because Nibiru supposedly lacked enough gold, the Anunnaki began searching space for a planet rich in the metal, and the source describes them leaving their world in spacecraft. That search leads to Earth, which the narrative portrays as a gold-rich planet found, while humanity's world was still in a primordial age, and the Anunnaki were already space travelers. After arriving, they find a wild Earth populated by prehistoric animals, and the source says the beings later remembered as creator gods chose Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf as their base. They establish a settlement for the mining operation at Eridu, which the source calls Earth Station 1, and they build a carefully cultivated garden beside that new center. That garden is identified as Eden, and described as a sacred paradise, where the Anunnaki spent time, while their larger mission on Earth remained the extraction of gold. The Anunnaki do not work alone, because the source says they brought another alien race called the Igigi, who were forced to serve them and perform the exhausting labor of gold mining. The narration links the Anunnaki and Igigi story to Babylonian material from the 18th century BCE, and says the Igigi eventually rebelled after thousands of years of forced labor. The revolt is described as the first war on Earth, but the Igigi fail to defeat the Anunnaki and are destroyed, which leaves the mining system without its slave workforce. To replace them, the source says the Anunnaki considered genetic engineering so they can create workers intelligent enough for complex labor, but not powerful enough to challenge their masters. The Atrahasis material is then presented as describing many earlier engineered creatures before humans with several experimental forms, judged imperfect, and eventually destroyed. The source says the Anunnaki finally combined their own DNA with Homo erectus DNA to create Homo sapiens, and judged the result strong enough for mining and intelligent enough for difficult work. An Iraqi tablet is said to call the first created human Adamu, which the narration connects with Adam, and after that first success, the Anunnaki begin creating more humans. The source says one later, human was created from Adamu's rib, and suggests this may connect with Eve, before describing the Anunnaki teaching their new workers basic human skills. Humans are taught speech, social behavior, farming, writing, construction, and technology, so they can serve the Anunnaki, while the source portrays their masters as extremely tall, powerful, and heavily armed. Those weapons supposedly prevented rebellion, and helped humans see the Anunnaki as gods to be worshipped, while the new human workforce was placed in mines and other locations across Mesopotamia. At first, the source says these humans were sterile, but rising demand for labor led the Anunnaki to alter human genetics again, so the population could reproduce by itself. The Anunnaki initially welcomed the growing workforce and allow humans to live in Eridu and visit Eden, but the permission carries a condition that human reproduction must remain limited. Humanity ignores that limit, and the source says overpopulation leads to expulsion from Eridu and Eden, which the narration connects with the story of Adam and Eve being driven from paradise. Outside Mesopotamia, humans supposedly become more capable and build new civilizations, while those remaining near the Anunnaki care for their descendants, and some unions produce mixed offspring called Nephilim, or ancient giants. The source then lists 7 principal Anunnaki gods, including Anu Enlil, Enkidu, Nana Inanna, and Utu, and begins with Anu as the oldest and most honored personification of heaven. Anu's wife Ki represents Earth, and their union is said to produce the Anunnaki as children of heaven and earth, which establishes the divine family structure used in the rest of the account. Enlil is presented as Lord of Air, Wind, and Storms, who separates heaven from earth, and is treated as so sacred that even other gods cannot look directly upon him. His authority is reinforced by the Tablet of Destinies, which governs the fates of gods and humans, and the source also gives him the title Father of the Black-Headed People. Enki is Enlil's brother and guardian of Eridu, as a powerful god of seas and rivers, and the source again makes him responsible for the genetic project that created human workers. After describing Enki and Ninhursag, the source turns to Nana as a moon god associated with wisdom, curiosity, science, and astronomy that are supposedly taught to humanity. Utu is then described as a solar figure of justice and truth, while his twin Ina is a goddess of fertility, war, and political power, who becomes known across Mesopotamia as Ishtar. The source says human overpopulation and interbreeding angered Enlil after he became leader of the Anunnaki, because he feared that mixed descendants might eventually rise to power and threaten Nibiru. Years later, Nibiru is said to return on its 3,600-year cycle, and its powerful gravity supposedly disrupts both the sun and earth, which the narrative presents as the beginning of catastrophe. Enlil allows nature to destroy the humans created by his brother, and the source then introduces the Kolbrin as an ancient Scottish text where Nibiru is called the Destroyer. The quoted idea says people forget the Destroyer's earlier days, while the wise know it will return at an appointed time, and the object is described as bright, fierce, unstable, and fiery. The source claims related material was removed from the Bible, and then shifts to science and astronomy, where it argues that the possible existence of Nibiru has modern support. It cites a 2017 NASA article and describes a hypothetical planet 9 with roughly 10 times Earth's mass and an orbit about 20 times farther from the Sun than Neptune. That distant planet is portrayed as lingering at the outer edge of the solar system, and the source imagines that a return inward would resemble a super-Earth entering the planetary neighborhood. Although the narrative says Nibiru usually passes without damage, it claims one close approach triggered disaster, and begins the sequence with unusual solar spots and a weakening terrestrial magnetic field. Temperatures then rise and polar ice begins to melt until sea level surges into a worldwide flood, while the source says the tablets describe Earth groaning before the waters arrive. On the night before disaster, Nibiru appears like a bright star, and the flood at Eridu is connected with the Eridu Genesis, even though the surviving tablet record is described as fragmentary. Those fragments are said to show Enlil using the flood as a chance to remove humans he considered unworthy while he planned to return to Nibiru, and other Anunnaki stayed to watch. The source says a huge Antarctic ice mass collapsed toward the sea and generated vast tsunamis as Anunnaki observers remained above the destruction in their craft. The waves then travel north through the gold mining region in North Africa and continue toward Eridu, where the city is said to disappear beneath waters near the Persian Gulf. The tablet description closes this phase with darkness during the day and a night sky where even the moon seems swallowed as the flood reaches its most terrifying stage. The source continues the tablet imagery, with the moon seeming swallowed by a monster as the ground shakes. Dark clouds erase the dawn and thunder and lightning announce the approaching disaster. Then the flood begins and Enki feels sympathy for the beings he helped create, so he secretly directs selected people to build a vessel before the waters overwhelm them. Among those survivors is Zeusudra, whom the narration links with Noah, and he is said to build a large boat that can preserve animals and the remaining human population. Other versions describe the flood as divine punishment for population limits being broken, while a damaged tablet called the Shile Fragment presents Zeusudra as a righteous priest of Enki. After Enki warns him, Zeusudra builds the vessel and sails for 7 days and 7 nights through darkness, heavy rain, violent storms, and massive waves. The boat carries animals, Zeusudra's family, and other survivors, and even when the strongest waves and storms stop, the source says heavy rain continues for 40 days and nights. The narration says flood stories appear across many civilizations and then returns to the ancient myth where after 40 days Utu meets Zeusudra and receives sacrifices of a bull and sheep. Anu and Enlil are angry with Enki because his warning allowed Zeusudra to survive, so Zeusudra appears before them and asks forgiveness for himself and for Enki. His appeal succeeds, and the source says Enki is forgiven, while Zeusudra receives eternal life for preserving animals and a small group of humans considered worthy to continue. Zeusudra is then placed in a land beyond the sea called Dilmun, and the narration shifts to an Akkadian version preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In that version, the source says Enlil acts as Anu's advisor and complains that humanity has become unbearably noisy before proposing a flood that can eliminate the human race. The survivor there is called Utnapishtim, rather than Zeusudra, and once again Enki sympathizes with humans and warns him to construct a great boat before the flood arrives. The source then appeals to ice core research from Greenland and Antarctica and says sea level at the peak of the last ice age stood about 425 feet below today's level. It treats evidence of a rapid rise in sea level as support for a great flood, and then says surviving Anunnaki began reconstructing their spaceports after the waters finally receded. After the flood, the source says the Anunnaki rebuild a new spaceport and design structures around stellar positions, with a Sumerian line describing Earth as a reflection of the heavens. Enki approves the rebuilding, and the narrative says Enlil communicates from far away, while Enki remains on Earth and works on restoring the damaged spaceport network. Even though Enlil orders him back to Nibiru, the source claims that pyramids and other ancient structures impossible to build without advanced technology were actually made by the Anunnaki. Those monuments are said to serve as guides for a future return to Earth, and when the Anunnaki finally leave, the source describes their influence as already spread around the world. That influence is placed from Mesopotamia and India to South America, and Enki's sympathy for humanity is used to explain why he leaves people a large body of knowledge. Before returning to Nibiru, Enki supposedly teaches architecture, mathematics, music, writing, astronomy, politics, government, and other disciplines that humans can use after the Anunnaki depart. The source also says humans are taught monarchy with a rule that leaders preserve particular bloodlines so authority remains connected to descendants of Anunnaki or genetically modified humans. Kings after the departure are therefore portrayed as representatives of the Anunnaki who govern according to the ancient principles their former masters had established. The bloodline rule is offered as a possible explanation for why nobles once preferred marriage within their own class and treated descent as central to legitimate rule. The narration then notes speculation that the Anunnaki could have controlled Earth for centuries through selective breeding among noble families and inherited political power. Before leaving for Nibiru, the Anunnaki also supposedly order humans to construct ziggurat temples aligned with constellations so the buildings can help guide them back to Earth. The tablets are presented as leaving open the possibility that Nibiru will again approach Earth, and that the Anunnaki may someday return to reclaim authority over the human workers they created. From that promised return, the source jumps to 2005 when a film project would turn Sitchin's Anunnaki ideas into a new controversy in popular culture. In 2005, the source says movie audiences heard claims that a film had been suppressed because its story could weaken religious faith and challenge beliefs about human origins. The film was one Anunnaki, and the source identifies its director as John Gress, who was better known for special effects work than for directing major films. Gress planned the independent project as the first part of a trilogy, and the screenplay drew its inspiration from Zecharia Sitchin's book, The Anunnaki Chronicles. The source says Sitchin's presentation could sound convincing because genetic engineering by aliens was framed in a way some viewers might find logically understandable. At the same time, the narration says many experts considered Sitchin's theory absurd and highly speculative, which made the interpretation controversial and open to direct challenge. Despite that controversy, the source is explicit that Sitchin's theory was never banned around the world, and that the censorship story does not hold up. The unfinished film simply tried to visualize Sitchin's ideas in detail, and the source says it too was not formally prohibited by any authority. It was never released in theaters or on major platforms, but the narration says the absence of a release should not be confused with evidence of censorship. According to former crew members and other people involved with the production, the real problem was insufficient budget and the inability to continue making the film. The source adds that material from Anunnaki can now be found online, and says the screenplay itself has been sold by John Gress through Amazon. So the supposedly dangerous Anunnaki story was far less explosive than rumors suggested, even though it continued to raise claims that humans had been created by aliens. The final discussion says worship of Anunnaki deities belongs mainly to the ancient era, and that modern claims of organized worship have very little supporting evidence. The source offers several possible reasons for that lack of evidence, and suggests that worship was not centered in one unified modern movement. Instead, it concludes that devotees of individual Anunnaki deities appear to have had separate cults, which keeps the surviving evidence fragmented rather than pointing to one common sect.